The weekend had promised tranquility, a brief respite from the relentless hum of city life. John, a man of 30 with a sturdy frame and a sense of adventure, had planned this getaway with his wife Elizabeth, who at 27, had always harbored a fascination for the unknown. Their children, Daniel, a curious boy of 9, and Emily, a bright-eyed girl of 7. As the family's car wound its way through the dense woods, the trees grew taller and more foreboding, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading sunlight. The road narrowed, and soon, they found themselves before the towering gates of an old Gothic-style mansion. The house stood imposingly against the backdrop of a darkening sky, its high-pointed gables piercing the air like daggers. John stepped out of the car, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the surroundings. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees with a mournful howl, as if the very earth was sighing under the weight of some ancient sorrow. The sky, heavy with ominous clouds, seemed to press down upon them. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off, attributing it to the chill in the air. "This place has character," John remarked, trying to sound enthusiastic as he looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "It's certainly isolated," she replied, her voice trailing off as she stared at the house, its windows like dark, hollow eyes watching their every move. While John and Elizabeth busied themselves unloading the car, Emily, ever the explorer, slipped away unnoticed. She wandered through the overgrown garden, her small feet crunching on the gravel path, until she reached the side of the house. A narrow, shadowed corridor led her to a wooden door, slightly ajar, that beckoned her to enter. Pushing the door open with a creak, Emily found herself in a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, mingled with something else, something metallic like the faint tang of blood. Her heart quickened with both fear and excitement as she ventured further inside. The hallway led to a steep staircase descending into darkness. Curiosity getting the better of her, Emily hesitated only a moment before beginning her descent. Each step creaked under her small weight, the sound echoing ominously off the stone walls. As she reached the bottom, she felt an icy draft brush past her, making her skin prickle. In the dim light, she could make out the shape of a large, ornately carved wooden chest sitting in the center of the room. The chest was ancient, with iron bindings and strange symbols etched into the wood. It seemed out of place, as if it had been there for centuries untouched by time. As Emily moved closer, she heard it, the faintest whisper, a murmur of voices too quiet to make out but unmistakably real. As Emily approached the chest, the mysterious voices grew louder, causing her to feel a chilling sense of dread. Just as her trembling hand touched the chest's cold surface, the voices abruptly stopped, leaving her in eerie silence. Elizabeth clung to John's arm, her face pale. "We have to go down there," she whispered, her voice trembling. John nodded, summoning all his courage. He led the way, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to protect his family from whatever horrors awaited them below. The old staircase groaned under their weight, and a sense of foreboding settled heavily in their chests. At the bottom, the sight that greeted them was both shocking and terrifying. Emily stood motionless in the center of the room, her eyes wide and unseeing, as if she were in a trance. Her hand hung limply at her side, and a dark figure loomed over her, its features obscured by shadow. The figure's mouth curved into a chilling smile, revealing sharp, elongated fangs that glistened in the faint light. "Welcome," the figure intoned, its voice a low, sinister hiss that sent a wave of dread through the family. Elizabeth gasped, pulling Daniel closer to her, while John stepped forward protectively, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure stepped back, releasing its hold on Emily, who collapsed to the floor unconscious. "Leave her alone," John shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by John's bravado. "You have entered my domain," it said softly, "and now you will all pay the price." As the figure began to advance toward them, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger, John knew that they had to escape. But the house itself seemed to come alive, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening, trapping them in a nightmare from which there was no waking. John's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He glanced at Elizabeth and Daniel, both paralyzed with fear, and then back at the figure that now stood between them and the stairs. The cold grip of panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down, knowing that he had to remain calm for the sake of his family. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling, "wake up. We need to get out of here." But Emily remained motionless on the floor, her breathing shallow, as if she were in the grip of a terrible nightmare. The figure chuckled darkly, the sound reverberating through the room. "There is no escape," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You belong to me now." As it spoke, the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move, taking on shapes that twisted and writhed like living things. But there was nowhere to go. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulse and breathe, trapping them in a living nightmare. With a sudden burst of courage, John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver crucifix. Holding it up toward the figure, "Stay back," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, the figure hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it regarded the crucifix. But then with a swift, almost contemptuous gesture, it swatted the crucifix out of John's hand, sending it clattering across the floor. "You think that can stop me?" the figure sneered, its voice dripping with disdain. "I am beyond your feeble faith. I am eternal." As the figure advanced, John felt a cold dread settle over him. He had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of another being. The light seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, growing brighter and more intense with each passing second. The figure shrieked in pain, its form dissolving into the shadows as the light engulfed it. The tendrils that had been reaching for the family recoiled and vanished. The room began to tremble as if the very foundations of the house were being torn apart. John stumbled back, gasping for breath, as the light continued to blaze, driving the shadows away. He could hear the figure's screams of rage and despair as it was consumed by the light, its presence fading into nothingness. The air in the upstairs hallway was thick with dust, the kind that settled over years of neglect. Daniel, eager to explore the ancient manor, wandered off from his parents and sister, his curiosity piqued by the mysterious aura of the place. His footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floorboards as he ventured deeper into the forgotten recesses of the house. He found himself drawn to a large wooden door at the end of the corridor. It groaned in protest as he pushed it open, revealing a vast library. Shelves upon shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls, their spines cracked and worn, each one a relic of another time. The room was dimly lit by the last rays of the setting sun that filtered through a single tall window, casting long shadows across the floor. Dust motes danced in the air, caught in the fading light, giving the space an almost ethereal quality. Daniel took a tentative step inside, his eyes wide with wonder. He had always loved books, and this room felt like a treasure trove of secrets waiting to be uncovered. As he walked among the rows of shelves, his fingers lightly brushed the spines of the books, feeling the rough texture of the old leather beneath his skin. There was a strange, almost oppressive silence in the room, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards under his feet. He paused near an ancient-looking desk, its surface cluttered with papers yellowed with age, a thick layer of dust obscuring whatever was written on them. A large ornate mirror hung on the wall behind the desk, its surface clouded and mottled, reflecting only vague shapes and shadows. As Daniel continued to explore, a sudden chill settled over the room. He shivered, rubbing his arms to ward off the cold. It was then that he heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, carried on the cold air. It was so faint at first that he thought he might have imagined it. But then it came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Daniel!" The sound of his name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and utterly foreign, sent a jolt of fear through him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, but the room was empty. There was no one there, nothing to explain the voice that had called out to him. He swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the unease that was creeping up his spine, but the voice came again, louder this time, as if it were closer. "Daniel!" Panic began to set in. The voice was unmistakably calling to him, urging him to respond. He backed away from the desk, his eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the sound. That's when he felt it, a cold, icy breath on the back of his neck. His blood ran cold. He could feel the presence of something behind him, something that was not of this world. Every instinct told him to run, to flee from whatever horror was lurking in the shadows, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the spot. He forced himself to turn. His body moving in slow, agonizing motion, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the far corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form vague and indistinct, like a wisp of smoke that had taken on a vaguely human shape. The shadow seemed to pulse and writhe, its edges shifting and blurring as it began to move toward him. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the shadow approached. It moved with a deliberate slowness, as if savoring the fear that it was instilling in him. The room grew colder with each passing second, the temperature dropping to a point where Daniel could see his breath misting in front of him. As the shadow drew nearer, Daniel could make out two faintly glowing eyes within the darkness, pale, soulless orbs that seemed to bore into his very soul. The eyes locked onto him, and Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal fear that paralyzed him where he stood. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was trapped in his throat, strangled by the sheer terror that had seized him. The shadow was almost upon him now. Elizabeth, who had been busy preparing a simple meal in the old kitchen, was suddenly seized by a deep sense of unease. The kitchen was a relic from another time, with iron pots and pans hanging from the ceiling, and a large, weathered wooden table in the center. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a far cry from the warmth and comfort she had hoped to find in this secluded getaway. The crackling of the old fireplace, which had been a source of comfort just moments ago, now seemed ominous, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The cry was quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the house, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through Elizabeth. Without a second thought, she abandoned the kitchen and rushed towards the narrow hallway leading to the basement. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the creaking floorboards underfoot only heightening her anxiety. As she reached the end of the hallway, she was met with an eerie stillness that seemed to suffocate her. She reached for the doorknob of the basement, her hand trembling. But as she tried to turn it, she was met with resistance. The door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, but it was as if the door had been fused shut by some unseen force. Panic began to set in as she heard a faint whispering sound, like the hushed breath of 100 voices, coming from within the walls themselves. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as the temperature around her plummeted, the air growing so cold that her breath formed visible clouds. She felt something shift in the atmosphere, an almost imperceptible change that set her nerves on edge. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling her ears with a cacophony of indistinct voices that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, their tones filled with malice and dread. The walls around her seemed to pulse with the life of their own, breathing in rhythm with the terrifying presence that held her captive. Desperately, she tried to pull away, but the hand tightened its grip, pulling her back toward the door. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, draining her strength, as if the very life was being sucked out of her. The whispers were now a roar, overwhelming her senses, drowning her in a sea of terror. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand released her. Elizabeth stumbled forward, gasping for breath, her heart racing. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the dark, empty hallway behind her. The voices had gone silent, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing in the oppressive stillness. But the door to the basement remained shut, its secrets locked away from her. She knew she had to get to her daughter, to find out what had happened, but the fear that had gripped her was almost too much to bear. She forced herself to move, to reach for the door again, but this time she was met with a force even greater, an invisible barrier that kept her from getting any closer. The basement was a chaotic blend of terror and darkness as the family huddled together, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen malevolence, and the very essence of the house felt alive with a sinister force. Shadows, dark and shapeless, danced menacingly around them, their forms shifting and elongating as if hungry for their fear. John's heart raced as he tried to shield his family, but the oppressive darkness seemed to twist and constrict around them, resisting his every effort. The shadows took on ghastly shapes, morphing into nightmarish figures that seemed to leer and taunt them. Emily clung to her mother, her small frame trembling uncontrollably, while Daniel stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror as the darkness pressed closer. Elizabeth felt a cold breath on her neck, sending shivers down her spine. She turned to see a shadowy tendril reaching out toward her, its cold touch seeping through her clothes and chilling her to the bone. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of sinister voices. John fought against the encroaching darkness, his fists clenched as he swung at the shadows, but they slipped through his grasp like smoke. The basement seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing in as the shadows grew more oppressive. The fear was palpable. Just as the family felt the crushing weight of imminent doom, a brilliant light pierced through the darkness. It was as if the very essence of the night had been shattered by the sudden appearance of a figure. An elderly man in a flowing white robe emerged. He held a large silver cross, its surface gleaming with an otherworldly light. The man, with an air of solemn authority, began to chant in an ancient language. His voice was steady and powerful, carrying an echo of something far older than the house itself. The words of the incantation seemed to unravel the very fabric of the darkness, causing the shadows to writhe and recoil as if in pain. The light from the cross intensified, casting long blinding beams that sliced through the encroaching darkness. The shadows hissed and howled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the light forced them back. The oppressive air began to clear, the temperature slowly rising as the malevolent presence retreated. John watched in stunned silence as the figure chanted. The light from the cross pushed the shadows further away until they were nothing more than distant echoes of terror. The basement, once a den of fear, was now illuminated by the pure, calming light of the cross. The family, exhausted and shaken, stood together. The old man finished his incantation and slowly lowered the cross. He looked at the family with a mixture of sadness and relief. His eyes, though tired, held a depth of knowledge and experience that spoke of countless encounters with the dark forces. They gathered their children and prepared to leave, each step away from the basement feeling like a release from a suffocating grip. As they exited the house, they cast one last, lingering glance at the ancient manor. The once intimidating structure now seemed serene. The family made their way back to their car, their minds reeling from the night's events. They drove away from the cursed house, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. The forest, once a place of mystery and adventure, now seemed ominous. They promised themselves never to return to that haunted place, vowing to leave its dark secrets buried in the past. As they drove away, the old man stood at the edge of the forest, watching them depart. His expression was one of deep contemplation. With a final sorrowful glance at the manor, he turned and disappeared into the depths of the forest, his mission complete but the darkness still lingering in the shadows. The family, though relieved to have escaped the immediate danger, was forever changed.